welcome back to the Learn NASCAR DFS strategy. We talked some track types already. Now let's talk the key concepts. Number of laps, it varies tremendously throughout NASCAR races, anywhere from like 30 in some truck races to like 500. And that changes the amount of points that drivers are going to score considerably. So as the number of laps increases in a NASCAR race, how should that affect our DFS strategy?
Right. Something that I always allude to is that you have to think of lineup construction in NASCAR DFS like a sliding scale. The fewer the laps there are in a race, like you said, that with some truck races, there are as few as 30, while we go on the far end to Bristol and Martinsville in the Cup races, and we have 500 laps. The fewer the laps that we have, the less emphasis that we have on those Dominator points because, well, there's fewer of them. However, when we go to the higher end of the scale, we're placing a gigantic emphasis on Dominator points because there's so many of them. The fewer the points, the less we're worrying about Dominator points and the more we're worried about place differential and finishing position. But when we move up to the higher end of laps, the higher end of points, finishing position and place differential, they have their merits for some drivers, but we are really concerned about those Dominator points for the high-end drivers.
Let's talk about those Dominators for a second. So not any driver can rack up these points. As I learned quickly when I was learning NASCAR, there's probably about 15 drivers in a race that have a decent chance of getting Dominator points, but really it's like the same 8 to 10 guys every single week that are getting these points. So how do we pick out who's going to get the Dominator points and who's not?
Yeah. In a recent study that I did during the off season, I found out whether you were looking at the 550 horsepower package or the 750 horsepower package, that practically all of our top lap leaders, they were all coming from the top 10. And it makes sense. You put the best drivers and the best equipment up front, and as you scale down the starting grid, the degree of talent in the driver and the degree of equipment consistently falls until you get down to the bottom where you have lower end teams with lower end drivers. So all of your top tier guys are near the front. It only makes sense that that's where you're going to find your lap leaders.
Definitely. So one thing that helps a lot with Dominator points is the pole position. And obviously you want a guy starting first to get the leading laps at the start of the race, and they can kind of build throughout stage one on that lead. But what about the other drivers like 2 through 8 or even farther back in the race? How much does that affect how you're looking at these guys as their potential to score Dominator points?
Right. In that study that I previously mentioned, whether it was the 550 or the 750 horsepower package, your pole sitter was the driver leading the most laps on average. And that's a combination of clean air from as a result of being the driver out front, their pit stall that helps get them out front after a cycle of green flag or yellow flag pit stops. But as you go down the starting grid, there wasn't anything that really stuck out about where a certain driver should lead based on where they start. It really falls down to who that driver is and where they're starting in the top 10 based on how they've done at that track in the past and how they've done at that same type of track throughout the season.
So one important thing is the guy starting in number 1 and the guy starting in number 2 both are on the front of their rows. They like line up next to each other. So how does that affect the number 2's potential? Because like I know different tracks, sometimes they talk about these positions a little differently.
Right. The driver that starts as the pole sitter has the option of whether he wants to start in the left-hand lane or the right-hand lane. They give him the option, and depending on the track, sometimes that bottom lane has the preferred groove, or maybe even the top lane has the preferred groove. So the pole sitter is always going to have the advantage based on the lane preference. However, sometimes it really doesn't matter, and it's just a matter of a drag race between driver A and driver B, and who has the more talent, who has the better equipment, who can get off the line, and generally who can get down to that first corner better.
Definitely. Let's talk about maybe a guy that isn't in a top tier card that's starting first, so they could lose a lot of position, but they could also lead a lap. So how do you handle maybe a surprising guy starting in first?
Right. When we have these surprise pole sitters, I generally find myself just wanting to stay away, but you don't want to miss out on the opportunity of a low owned driver. And of course, he's going to be low owned because of the talent, because of the car, who he's starting around. You don't want to miss out on the opportunity of that random driver actually being able to beat out the guy that's he's next to, get out to the front and hold on to the lead for however many laps. So generally that falls back to me checking out current and past track data and figure out, is this a guy that I'm willing to take a bet on?
Definitely. I've definitely lost some points on, on those guys before. Now let's talk about penalties. So like maybe a guy fails their inspection. They were going to start in first. Now they are all the way in the back. So how is that going to affect how you're going to handle that guy in DFS?
Right. Um, because of our current COVID situation, we don't have qualifying at the majority of tracks. NASCAR does have qualifying this year, but it's only at the venues that they haven't raced at yet. So that's only a handful of places that we'll see qualifying. For most weeks, qualifying will be set by a calculation that NASCAR uses with past results at the race that they just went to, driver standings, and it spits out where drivers start according to all of these different equations. And once NASCAR has their initial starting grid for that upcoming race, then the field is set as early as Wednesday or Thursday before that race. So, like you said, when we get to actual race inspection before the race, if a driver fails technical inspection more than twice, then he loses his starting spot. Now, the key to remember is that he will still be scored from where he technically qualified at. So if your pole sitter wins the equation, starts first, but ends up failing technical inspection twice, he goes all the way to the back. He's really starting 40th, but he will be scored from first place still.
Yeah, that can be huge because you're getting the worst of both sides. They're not leading the early laps and you don't get the place differentials. So make sure to keep up to date on all the latest news. Usually NASCAR doesn't have a ton of late news, but sometimes those penalties can really affect the value of those guys starting up front. Now let's talk about crashes a little bit because I'm sure a lot of guys at NASCAR, that's kind of like the intriguing thing. The whole slate can flip on its head if someone crashes. Now, how can we predict like how likely that is to happen? Because I feel like it varies so much based on the actual race.
Yeah, it's really weird. When you think of that sliding scale, if you go to the shorter venues, you can see a large tendency for crashes because the cars are bunched up so close together. If you think of Bristol, if you think of Martinsville, we're talking about half-mile tracks. You put 40 cars together on a half-mile track, there's not a lot of room for movement. And when you're going around the corners, you can easily bump into somebody and turn them. You go to the mile and a half, right there in the middle, the intermediate tracks that we'll see action at quite a bit this season. The wrecks really don't happen all that often. However, then you go to the far end, the super speedways, the 2.5 mile ovals, then you do see lots of wrecks because of what happens with the draft, drivers being so close together, going so fast, and all it takes is for one car to get out of shape and they can take out half the field.
Yeah, that's always exciting if you don't have those guys. Now, I will point out that when they crash these cars, a lot of these teams are reusing like parts of these cars, and that is a significant financial impact to the team. So these guys really are trying to avoid these crashes. So do you think that the economics of it kind of affect who might be more likely to crash than others?
Yeah, definitely. For a lot of these lower tier teams, the difference between a profitable week and a week in the red comes down to how clean can that driver keep their vehicle, and in the process of keeping their car clean, how far can they advance up the from 1 through 40, how far can they advance their car up there as they gain position, they're gaining money from the purse. So it does matter a lot to these lower tier teams.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Thanks for tuning in to our Learn NASCAR DFS series. Talked some key concepts. We got some more for you guys, so make sure to follow our playlist here.